Thank you, Ashley, and Nikolai and Skip for inviting me to speak here today about my book and the immigration issue. I'm hoping that after I speak, we can get a good discussion going about this issue. Never a dull one, right? I want to first say that some of the photos I'm going to be showing you are by Don Bartletti of the LA Times, and they won a Pulitzer Prize, and they will instantly be distinguishable from my terrible photographs. We've been seeing one of the biggest crackdowns on undocumented or illegal immigration in decades. Every year now, there's about 1,300 pieces of legislation that are introduced at the local and state level trying to deal with this issue. And some of them crack down on hiring, like we've seen in Arizona and other states. Some of them on being able to rent to undocumented immigrants. Some of them look at trying to prohibit driver's licenses and trying to get more of the police to cooperate and work with ICE in deporting people. And I think a lot of these things are a response to these mounting frustrations that people feel about the federal government's inability to control this influx. And I think, you know, the issue has roiled Arkansas as much as most places. It's a place where there's about 100,000 immigrants. About half of those are thought to be here without permission. And there's talk of Arkansas trying to pass legislation similar to legislation that was passed in Arizona, the 1070 law that requires police to check immigration papers of anyone on the street that they suspect of being undocumented. So there have been many measures that have come up in Arizona and here in Arkansas that are trying to deal with this issue. I think I started to view this issue in a totally different way one morning in my kitchen in LA. I had a woman who would come and clean my house a couple of times a month named Carmen. And I remember that morning, she would usually come with her young son, and I assumed that this was her only child. And that morning I asked her, Carmen, are you thinking about having any more children? And she was normally this really chatty, really happy woman, but I remember that morning when I asked her that, she just went stone silent, and she started sobbing. And she explained to me that she had left 4 children that I didn't know about in Guatemala, in Central America. She said that she was a single mother. Her husband had left her for another woman. And that most days she could feed these kids, these 4 children, once, maybe twice, but that at night, these kids would cry with hunger, and she had nothing to give them. And I remember that morning in my kitchen in LA, how she explained that she would gently coax those 4 kids to roll over in their beds at night. And she said she would tell them, sleep face down so your stomach doesn't growl so much. I remember she told me that morning that she had left these children with their grandmother, and she had come north to work in the United States. And I remember her telling me that she hadn't seen her children in 12 years. Her youngest daughter was 1 year old. She was still breastfeeding that day that she had walked away from her. I remember standing there in my kitchen and just being stunned by her answer. I mean, I couldn't fathom, how does a mother walk away from her children? Can you all imagine doing that? What kind of desperation does it take to go 2,000 miles north and you have no idea when or if you're ever going to see your children again? And I remember asking myself, what choice would I make? If I knew that if I stayed in a place like Guatemala, you know, I could be there to love and protect my children, but they wouldn't eat. They may only go to the 3rd grade, which is all Carmen had been able to do. Or would I make that painful decision to come here so I could make money here and send money back for them to live a better life? And it was really, you know, that question that I had that morning in my house in LA that launched me on this incredible journey. This is what Carmen looked like when I met her, or actually a couple of years ago. But it launched me on this amazing journey that would take me to Central America and up the migrant routes through Mexico and into the homes of dozens and dozens of women who were just like Carmen, who had the same story. To me, that story that she told me, Carmen's choice, That's a terrible choice. I mean, that's not a choice I would wish on any parent. A lot of these women, they come here and they take care of other people's children. They play with them, they feed them, they take them to the park, but they're not there to hear their own children's first words or to watch their own kids take their first steps. Or can you imagine not being there on Christmas morning with your children, or they're not there for their daughter's quinceañeras? But what I learned as I started to look at this issue was that her experience was incredibly common. In LA, a study done showed that 4 out of every 5 live-in nannies still has a child left behind in their home country. And I think a lot of us know these women. They clean our offices, they clean our homes. For some of you, I wouldn't doubt that they have helped raise some of your children. I started to look at this, and what I found was that there was more and more family disintegration throughout Latin America, and that was really transforming who's coming now to the United States. I think, like a lot of people, I tended to think of undocumented or illegal immigrants as overwhelmingly men. But the reality was that there were millions of single mothers who had come here from Mexico and Central America and left their children behind. And in fact, today, a study showed that 51% of the 11 million people in this country without permission are now women and children, not men. So there's been this huge shift in who's coming. These women were really part of one of the largest waves of immigration in our nation's history. Today, 1 in 8 people now in this country are born in another country. In Los Angeles, where I'm from, 4 out of 10 people are born in another country. We have 1 million people coming here legally or becoming permanent residents each year. And despite our lousy economy, we still have 300,000 people coming here undocumented or illegally each year. That's down from about 850,000 a year in the first part of this decade. And if you look at our public schools across the country, 1 out of every 4 kids now in those schools nationwide is an immigrant or the child of an immigrant. And a lot of these new migrants were these single moms, and as I started to go into a lot of their homes in Texas and California, elsewhere in the U.S., they all told me the same story, every single one of them. The only way that they could leave their children that morning or that day was to give those kids a promise. Mija, I will be back. It will be 1 or 2 years at the most. But what they found was that life in the U.S. Is a lot tougher than advertised. And, you know, I know this as the child of immigrants. I think a lot of immigrants, when they talk back to folks in their home countries, you know, they talk about all the good stuff. I'm making $8 an hour. I have a car. No one in my little town has a car. What they don't express is that I'm working 2 jobs, and I'm sleeping 4 or 5 hours a night, and I'm living in a converted garage or in an apartment filled with 10 or 15 other people, and I'm struggling to pay my bills here and send money back to my children, and trying to save $8,000 that I have to pay the smuggler to bring each child north from Central America. And so these separations are hardly ever 1 or 2 years. Typically, they stretch, I found, to 5 or 10 years or even more. And a lot of these children get desperate to be with their mothers again. And so they get this idea in their head, well, if she can't come back to me like she promised or send for me like she said she was going to, I'm going to go find my mom. What I found in 2000 when I started to look at this was that there was this small army of children heading north each year from Mexico and Central America alone, without either parent, about 48,000 in that year. And to give you an idea of how that's grown, it's about 100,000 children coming alone each year from points south. And yeah, some of them are coming to work. Some of them are fleeing abusive families or situations in Latin America, but the majority are coming to reunify with a parent who left them behind. And for the Central Americans, 3 out of 4 were coming to find a mom who had left them behind. And so I told this story through one boy, Enrique, and he's just 5 years old when his mother leaves him in the capital of Honduras, in Tegucigalpa, and she comes to work in the United States. And at first, Enrique, this is what he looked like at that time, he's just bewildered by this because, you know, when his mother was there, she would sell things from a little box on the dusty sidewalks of Tegucigalpa, and he would play alongside as she was working. So she was always with him, and suddenly his mother has just disappeared. And he begs his paternal grandmother, who he's left with, when is my mommy coming back for me? Is she coming back? And when he's just devastated without his mother. When he's 11 and 12 years old, on Christmas morning, he stands by the door of his grandmother's wooden shack, and he prays to God, please, for my Christmas present, God, bring my mother back to me. And he sees a lot of other kids walking hand in hand with their moms down the streets of Tegucigalpa. And of course, he wants the same thing that they have. And Enrique goes from being a lonely boy to, quite frankly, a pretty troubled adolescent without his mother by his side. And so after 11 years of not seeing his mother, he sets off to go find her, and this is what he looked like at that time. And Enrique, like all of these kids, I mean, he wants to answer, they all tell me the same thing. He wanted to answer one question. Does my mother love me? You know, she said she was going to return or send for me, and she hasn't. And he left with little more than this tiny scrap of paper with her phone number inked on it, his mother's number in the U.S. It's amazing when you're on the migrant routes, you'll see these children, they'll pull that little slip of paper, usually it's the only thing they have on them, and they hide it in the sole of their shoe or in the waistband of their jeans, and they'll wrap it in a bit of plastic so that when they cross rivers or it rains or hails on them, you know, their prayer is that number, that precious number, won't smudge. So Enrique had that little number and that scrap of paper, and he's virtually penniless like most of these kids, so he goes the only way that he can, which is gripping onto the tops and sides of these freight trains that travel up the length of Mexico. I found that there were thousands of children who make this journey in this way each year, and that the youngest of these kids are 7 years old. I was traveling with this boy, Dennis, 12 years old. I mean, I think most of you, as parents, would not let your children at 7 or 12 go to school alone. And these children are traversing 4 countries, a lot of that time, you know, gripping on for dear life to the top of a freight train. It's an incredible adventure. I mean, there's no GPS. They're guiding themselves by little more than the arc of the sun and word of mouth. And it's also harrowing beyond belief, this journey that these kids go on. Most of them, they don't make it through Mexico. They try many times to get through and end up, after a bad experience, you know, back in their home country, really defeated by this adventure. And some of them are killed. They're torn apart by the train wheels along the way. And all of them are hunted down like animals, really, by a variety of bad actors along the rails. There's these bandits who operate alongside the rails. At the time, this was the most well-known immigration stop by the immigration authorities in Mexico, in southern Mexico. It was called La Rosera. And the train slows, and everyone creeps down the ladders on these trains. And the trick is to go around this 3-mile checkpoint, elude the immigration agents as you're getting off the train, run around the checkpoint, and get on the train as it's moving on the other side. The trouble is that in those 3 miles, there's a swarm of bandits, 3 to 5 swarms of bandits waiting for you, armed with everything from machetes to Uzis. I mean, the cops don't have Uzis, but the bandits, many of whom are former cops, are armed with Uzis. And they will rob you and rape the girls and sometimes leave you for dead alongside these train tracks. And if the bandits don't get you, oftentimes the cops in Mexico will. There's about a dozen police agencies in Mexico that target migrants on top of these trains. And they'll stop the train and line up everyone and rob them and of your hat, your shoes, your belt, whatever coins they can find, and then deport you back to the southern border. We're not the only country that deports people. Mexico was deporting about 200,000 people. Now it's gone down to about 100,000 people a year. So there's the cops that you have to deal with, and here they're getting ready to deport these youngsters. And if those two things don't get you, oftentimes the train itself will. The Central Americans are crossing Mexico illegally, without permission. They can't get on at the train station, so they have to get on and off these trains as they're moving. And take my word for it, this is a lot tougher than it looks. The rail bed slants, it's made up of these huge rocks, and the ties are very slippery, they're soaked in creosote. And for the kids, usually the ladder starts at their waist. It can be even higher if the train is banking away from them. And they're trying to get, unlike in this photograph, there's usually several migrants trying to get on the same ladder. So you're trying to elude those immigration agents and get up on this thing, and it can be very, very tricky. And a lot of people do not navigate this successfully, like this boy who I met in a hospital in Oaxaca, 17 years old, had been trying to get on a moving freight train. This was the first day that his parents had seen him. And I spent a lot of time in a shelter in southern Mexico run by this wonderful woman, Olga Sanchez, that's for people mutilated by the trains, a whole shelter. You walk into this place, it's rooms filled with people with no arms and no legs, like Fausto, who lost half his foot to the train. They have many names for the train. One is El Tren Devorador, the train that devours. This 14-year-old boy who lost both parts of both legs to the train. You know, I think all of us here have heard how hard it is to cross that 2,000-mile-long U.S.-Mexico border, and it's hard. There's about 6,000 people who have died trying to do that in recent years. Here I am crossing with some gentlemen the Rio Grande into Texas. But the Central Americans will tell you that this is a cakewalk compared to getting through Mexico, and especially the southernmost state of Chiapas, which they call the Beast. And they say when they start trying to go through Chiapas, ahora nos enfrentamos a la bestia, now we face the beast. And I think this was by far for me the hardest part of this journey. There are these gangsters who operate on top of the trains. It's the MS gang, Mara Salvatrucha, that started in Los Angeles, and we generously exported it to Latin America. And there's about 10 or 20 of these guys on top of each train, armed with machetes, knives, wooden bats, sometimes even guns. And they'll go from car to car, and they will surround a group of migrants and tell them your money or your life. And they'll strip you of whatever clothes you have on, and sometimes, just for the heck of it, they will throw some of the migrants down to the churning wheels below. And this happens to the boy that I write about, Enrique. He's on top of this train, it's pitch dark, middle of the night, and 6 of these guys start creeping up this ladder, and they throw him face down on top of that train. And they start beating his face with a wooden club, and they shatter 3 of his teeth. And they strip off his clothes to find what he has, and he has almost nothing, so they beat him even harder. And one of these thugs starts to strangle Enrique with a bit of his own clothing. And he's trying to pull this away from his throat and at the same time try to buffer his face from these blows. And he hears one of these thugs yell out, "Throw him off the train." And he is thinking in his own mind, I'm going to die here alongside the tracks, and my mother will have no idea what happened to me. Suddenly, this guy strangling him slips on top of the train as it's jostling, and that noose loosens for a moment, and Enrique gets to his knees and stands, and he runs down this rounded fuel tanker and flings himself off this train as it's going 40 miles an hour. And when he finally comes to the next day, he's walking along the tracks. You know, the only thing they've left him are his underwear. He's covered in blood, his eyes are filled with blood, and these townswomen see him and they surround him, and they press coins into Enrique's hand and they tell him, "Go home. You're going to die trying to do this." And he says, "I can't. I have to reach my mom." The migrants call this El Tren de la Muerte, the train of death. And that night, that terrible beating, is just the beginning of the challenges that he and these other kids face. I came to understand those challenges all too well, and the incredible kindness and cruelty that these kids witness on these trains, because I saw a lot of it myself. I met Enrique when he had already made it to northern Mexico. He was in Nuevo Laredo, right across from Laredo, Texas. And I was just incredibly moved by what Enrique had been through. I mean, he was 1,700 miles from home. He was on his 8th attempt to get through Mexico. He was sleeping outside on the muddy banks of the Rio Grande. He was trying to survive. I mean, he was eating once a day. And I really wanted to understand what that struggle had been like on this journey and all the dangers that he and these other children face. And I wanted readers who were reading about his journey to feel like they were up there on the train alongside him, feeling everything as it happened to him. So I decided to do the journey myself. I spent a couple of weeks with Enrique hearing about everything he had been through on those 8 attempts and everyone who had harmed and helped him along the way. And I went back to Honduras, where he started, and I did the journey step by step, exactly as he had done it a few weeks before. So I traveled 1,600 miles, and about half of that on top of 7 freight trains. I am not totally insane. Usually I get a look or two like that. I took a lot of precautions. I got a letter from the president of Mexico saying, please treat this woman kindly. And that letter helped keep me out of jail 3 times along the way on this journey. But it was a high-stakes ride. I mean, my first train ride, and I had spent weeks inside jails that ICE has just for children coming into the U.S. alone. We now have 40 such facilities in the U.S. That gives you a sense of the magnitude. I was asking these kids, interviewing them, tell me everywhere you went and everything bad that happened to you, so, hopefully I can find a way to avoid that. None of them mention these, I'm sorry, that's what Enrique looked like when I met him. I'm one slide behind here. None of them mentioned these branches that envelop the tops of the trains in Chiapas, in the south of Mexico. It's really lush. It's very jungle-like. And so this was my first, this ride exactly was my first train ride, and it was the middle of the night, and there were maybe 120 people on top of this train. And the people towards the front, towards the locomotive, they started screaming back this warning. And they were yelling, Rama, branch. But this train is incredibly loud. And I was holding on with both hands because the tracks are so bad that it bucks from side. If you don't hold on with both hands, there's no way you're staying on that train. But I didn't hear that warning. And this huge branch hit me square in the face, and it set me sprawling back, almost off this train. I was able to grab onto a rail on the side of the train and pull myself back up on top of it. And when this train finally stopped the next day, there were these 2 teenagers behind me, and one of them told me that another teen with them had been swiped off by the same branch that hit me. And they assumed that he was dead because when these trains move forward, they produce this sucking wind underneath, so when you fall down, it sucks you into the wheels. In the south of Mexico, I could see the gangsters, lunging at people and knifing them and robbing them. And once when I was in the north of Mexico, that one time, luckily I was very towards the front of the train, I had one of these guys try to grab me. And I was able to get away from him and hop forward 3 cars and beg the conductor to save me from this guy. I was on a train where the one right in front of me derailed. I think at the time, 1 in 6 trains in Chiapas was derailing. Very bad tracks. And I had heard from so many kids that if you're on those cars, they had seen children buried alive in sand in these hoppers or crushed as these cars tipped over. Well, when I finally got back to my lovely home in Los Angeles, after this 3 months of this, I did the journey twice, 3 months each time. I had this nightmare every night that there was this gangster running after me on top of the train trying to rape me. And I had to go into therapy for about 6 months to get rid of that nightmare. I felt most days on those trains tense and filthy and in fear of being robbed or beaten. In the south of Mexico, it's unbearably hot. I know you all know hot here, but it's 105 degrees and you're sitting on a piece of metal that I couldn't touch with my bare hands without burning them. And in the north, it's incredibly cold. I described some of the things these migrants do on the train to keep from freezing to death along the way. I don't know if you've ever felt like you were at your breaking point, where you're in a situation where you think in your mind, I can't take another minute of this. This has to stop. Well, that's how I felt on these trains towards the end of those rides. But when that train would finally stop, you know, I'd get off and I'd whip out my credit card and I'd go have a real meal and I'd sleep in a motel. I mean, I'd have to put the chair up against the door, but it was a bed. And I think the reason I talk about what I went through is that I knew that what I had gone through was one iota of what these kids go through. Enrique, the boy I write about, he endured months of danger and misery. You know, he would sleep in sewage culverts to hide from the immigration authorities, in clumps of grass. Kids describe sleeping in trees to protect themselves from predatory animals along the way. And Enrique described going 2 days without a drop of water. I don't know if you've tried doing that for one day. He said he felt like his throat was swelling shut. I remember in the South, I mean, it would be so hot and the train would stop and there would be nowhere to run to beg for a little bit of water, and there would be these sewage ditches next to the rails. They call them aguas negras, black water. And I would watch these kids who I was with. They would put their T-shirt up against their mouth and they would scoop this up, and they figured that the T-shirt would filter out some of the impurities, but they were so desperate to get something liquid into them. I couldn't fathom what these children were willing to do to reach the United States. But to Enrique, he explained to me that all of those things were nothing compared to his yearning to be with her, Lourdes, his mom. And he said that whenever he explained to me as we sat on the banks of the Rio Grande, that he had felt alone his whole life without her. And that whenever he thought about turning back, he remembered how, you know, she would call him in Honduras and always end those conversations with, I love you, I miss you. And that would, he said, keep him going forward. I don't want to portray everything as negative on this journey that these kids go on. Enrique was preyed upon mercilessly, but he also was visited by incredible acts of kindness. I think Chiapas, the southernmost state of Mexico, it's fair to call it the heart of darkness. Most of these children, they're beaten and robbed several times before they get out of the first of 13 states that they have to cross. But I think that the south central state of Veracruz, really, it restored my faith in humanity after being through Chiapas. There are these places in Veracruz where there's a curve in the tracks like here, or for some reason that train has to slow down. And in those places, when people hear that whistle of the train, I would see 10, 20, 30 people rush out of these little towns, out of their homes, with bundles of food in their arms. And they would wave and they'd smile and they'd shout out to these migrants on top of the train. And they would throw bread, they threw tortillas, they threw whatever fruit was in season. Here in this beautiful photograph, oranges, pineapples. When I was on the train, they were lobbing me with bunches of bananas. If there's no fruit or food, they throw bottles of tap water. And if they don't even have that, they come out and they give a silent prayer for these migrants as they pass by on top of the trains. I think what amazed me was that these are the poorest Mexicans who live along the rails. I mean, a lot of these folks, they're making $1 or $2 a day. And they explained to me that they could barely feed their own children tortillas and beans. But they told me that, and they're giving away food to total strangers who pass by in a flash, people from other countries, and these are people that they're never going to see again. But they explained to me that they were doing this every day in some instances because they believe that this is the Christian thing to do. And they said that this was the right thing to be doing. And they also said that this is what Jesus would do if he were in their shoes. And a lot of them had seen the suffering up close. They had seen people lose arms and legs to the train. I remember being with a boy who hadn't eaten in a day and on the train, and a bundle landed in his arms. And he started crying with joy and gratefulness for receiving this food. And I think this was the best part of the journey for me. Maria Maria was claiming that she was way more than 100 years old, and that during the Mexican Revolution, she had been reduced to, she was so hungry that she was reduced to eating the bark of the plantain tree in her front yard. And you can't tell because of my terrible photograph, but her hands are totally gnarled with age. But she would force them to make these little bags with little tortillas, salsa, little beans. And when she heard that whistle of the train, she would hand these bags to her 70-year-old daughter, who ran down that rocky slope and heaved them up to the people on top of the trains. And I will always remember what Maria told me that day. If I have one tortilla, I'll give half away. I know God will bring me more. I met some amazing heroes along the tracks. They really deserve to be called heroes, like Francisca. I mean, very poor woman. And yet, 4 times a day she would go out and give food, including in the middle of the night to migrants on top of the train. And you see in her house, I mean, it's one room. She's scrunched together 3 beds. And every night, she and her 2 children sleep on 1.5 beds. And she allows 3 migrants, these are people she didn't know that morning, to sleep in the other 1.5 beds. I call that living your faith. I have written about immigration on and off for about 25 years now. God, I'm dating myself. But there were really some things I didn't understand until I made this journey on the trains. I think the first thing is the incredible desperation that's driving people out of places like Honduras. You know, I speak at a lot of universities, and I have students come up to me and say, I thought they were just coming here to steal my job. And I tell them, well, it's a little more complicated than that. In Honduras, there's 42% unemployment and subemployment, 42%. And the newspaper ads, it's actually legal to do this, will spell out if you're 28 years or older as women, don't even bother applying for a job. Most of us in this room would not qualify for employment in Honduras. I think the woman who really brought this home for me was a woman I met in Mexico. She was trying to work her way through, Leti Isabela Mejia Llanes. And Leti explained to me that in Honduras she had 3 kids, single mom, but that all she could give these kids to eat each day was 2 pieces of bread and a watery cup of coffee. And her youngest son, Daniel, 1-year-old, he only got 1 piece of bread and some breast milk. And she told me the same thing all these mothers said. At night when those kids would cry with hunger, she would fill this big glass with water, and she'd stir in a little teaspoon of sugar, a little dollop of tortilla dough, anything to fill up their bellies. And she told her kids, you know, I can't take this anymore. I want you to live in something better than this grinding misery that I grew up in. And she is described having, you know, a wooden shack with a tin roof, a dirt floor. Better in Enrique's neighborhood, some of the women would stitch together rags. This is in the capital, to have a roof over their head. But she told her kids, I'm going north. And her 9-year-old boy, Marvin, told her, Mommy, don't go. I already know how to write my name. I'll quit school and I'll help you work. Don't leave. And she said no. And as you can see, Leti stumbled trying to get on one of these moving freight trains. And she lost both of her legs to the train. I don't know if you can see that. You know, when I had that conversation with my house cleaner, and maybe you would feel the same urge that I felt that morning a long time ago, when she was telling me about leaving her kids, I was pretty judgmental. And the tone that Carmen was hearing in my voice was, what kind of crappy mother leaves their children? I mean, I just couldn't believe it. Not having children, I still couldn't believe it. But I really came to understand that decision that she and other women make a lot better when I saw the consequences for the kids in Honduras whose mothers decide to stay. In Enrique's neighborhood, those kids work here in this dump. It's on top of this hill in the capital, in Tegucigalpa, and trucks rumble up, and kids fight for position on either side of these trucks. And as the trash slides down, they pick out bits of tin, plastic, anything that they can sell. Some of these trucks were coming from a local hospital. So I know some of you are going to have dinner soon. I won't explain what was in the trucks, but I remember standing in this dump, in this stinking soup, and above us there was this swirling black cloud of vultures that were defecating on all of us below. I've worked for 25 years as a reporter, and I've never been in a place where I literally felt like I couldn't breathe. It was such an assault on the senses. But here's this 6-year-old boy. His hands blackened to his wrist, was reaching into this muck to pull out a bit of bread. I was stunned by the gritty determination of people to make it through Mexico to reach the U.S. I think Americans don't understand, quite frankly, this kind of determination. I mean, when we talk about building a 700-mile-long fence, we don't understand this kind of determination. I met a boy, he had tried 27 times to make it through Mexico. And the day that I met him, he was held up with a bandit with a machete to his throat as the girl in his party was taken one by these bandits into a neighboring cornfield and raped. And that day, the immigration authorities caught him, and he said, this time they'll deport me, and tomorrow I'm going to make attempt number 28 to reach my mom in the United States. And Enrique, he makes 8 attempts, and he travels 122 days and 12,000 miles. And I picked him because his story was typical, not atypical. It's a modern-day odyssey that a lot of these kids go on top of these freight trains. This was the day when whoops, I'm giving away the ending. When you're on top of these trains, I would see 100, 200 people, but the conductors described seeing 300, 400, 600 people on top of a train. They said it looked like a beehive covered with human beings. In fact, one of the names for the trains is El Tren Peregrino, the pilgrim's train. And the train conductors would joke to me, when we finally see the president of El Salvador on top of this train, we know the whole country has finally cleared out. Well, it's not much of a joke because 25% of El Salvador's population lives outside of their country, and most of them are here in the U.S. The reality, if we're being brutally honest, is that there's a modern-day exodus out of many parts of Mexico and several countries in Central America. For me, in writing about these women and kids, my hope was to, and it sounds odd to say it, but maybe not, in Arkansas and many other places where I speak, to humanize immigrants. Because I think in a lot of places, Arkansas saw the 4th largest increase in immigrants in the 1990s of any state. And I think in those instances where you see such rapid change, sometimes it's easier to demonize people than to try to understand them. I wanted people to put themselves in these women's shoes. And let's say you weren't lucky enough to be born in a place that's wealthy, relatively, like the United States. Let's say that your roll of the dice gave you Honduras, and you had children crying at night, and the cupboards were bare, and you had nothing to give them. Wouldn't you at least consider heading north to the United States so that you could feed them and they could study? And a lot of these women tell me, I know what I'm doing is wrong. I know that I'm breaking a law, and I hope God can forgive me for it. And here I'm going to stir the pot, maybe. But I also came to understand that these levels of illegal immigration, 4% of everyone in this country now is here without permission, I believe have a downside and really can't continue at this rate. Let me first say, I think there are a lot of benefits to this influx. If you talk to Enrique's mom, Lourdes, she'll tell you that she does backbreaking work for minimum wage, no vacation time, no health benefits. A lot of jobs that she would argue Americans are not going to do for minimum wage. And some of the things I would agree with her. She would clean houses where suicides had taken place and wipe down the walls. I doubt many of you all are going to raise your hand and say, ooh, let me do that job for minimum wage. I've seen people pick crops, stooped over for 14 hours a day, cut sugar cane in the swamps of Florida in the searing heat with a machete. I think a lot of those dirty, hard, dangerous, repetitive jobs, you're not going to find a lot of Americans who are thrilled about doing those. The best study looking at the effects of immigration by the National Research Council found that they really help drive the economy, and they contribute a modest but significant amount to our $13 trillion economy. And they also found that immigrants help make certain goods and services cheaper and therefore available to more of us. 5% of everything that you buy is cheaper because of immigrant labor. And so that means more of us can buy things like go to the restaurant, get childcare for our children, get our lawn mowed, all sorts of goods and services. And economists really believe that immigrants help prevent a lot of businesses that would have to pay those higher prices, whether it's at the poultry plant where, meatpacking plants, they used to pay $22 an hour. Now they pay $12 an hour. If they had to pay $22 an hour, you might be bringing our chickens in from someplace else. So it would force outsourcing of some jobs and closing down of certain factories and other work. So there are many positives. But I think in talking about this from a social justice point of view, it's important to remember that there are winners and losers. I don't see this as a black and white issue. I see this as an issue with a lot of shades of gray. And the losers are the ones most hurt by this influx are the 1 in 14 Americans who do not have a high school degree. And they've seen their wages drop by 8% over 20 years, according to a Harvard study, because of competition from immigrants for certain kinds of jobs. That's mostly African Americans and previous waves of Latino immigrants. And so I would argue that in some kinds of jobs, construction, 1 in 7 construction workers is undocumented, 1 in 4 roofers is undocumented. I would argue that Americans are willing to do those jobs if they're paid a high enough wage to do them. So for me, as someone who's long written about the disadvantage in this country, I find that drop in wages pretty troubling. The reality is that immigrants are predominantly poor. That's why they're coming here. And because they're poor, they pay on average 1/3 less taxes than people born here. And they and their kids qualify for and use more government services. And that's not really welfare. That's mostly that immigrants have twice as many children as people born here. Those kids go to public schools. And in my home state of California, that costs $2 billion a year. Something that's talked about less is that the cost-benefit calculation, what I found was that it's in some ways just as troubling for the immigrants themselves. It's undeniably true that when these moms come here, they are able to send money back to their kids. And their kids do study and they do eat. Enrique's sister, Belki, she goes to university. I mean, in her slums in Tegucigalpa, almost no one is able to do that. And that's huge. I don't want to minimize that in any way. But it's equally true that after years apart from your children, your kids say, what happened? You abandoned me. You said you were coming back in 1 or 2 years. You didn't come back. And they resent and even walk up to the line of hating their mothers for leaving them. I've probably interviewed 200 or 300 children. They've all said the same thing. What they say is, I would have rather gone hungry, but had my mom by my side growing up. And these kids are very tough on their moms. I saw a boy in LA say to his mother's face, even a dog doesn't leave its litter. And I think what's really sad about these separations is that in the end, a lot of these mothers lose what's most important to them, which is the love of their children. I want to end on a political note, being here. They say that immigration reform is going to be raised after the November elections. We'll see. But that Obama basically needs to get all those Latinos excited about going to the polls in 2 years. And we are, 9% of the electorate, and apparently that could make the difference. I think when that happens, it's important to keep in mind that in the past 3 or 4 decades, your politicians have sold you on 3 solutions to reducing undocumented or illegal immigration. And I'm taking it as a given that 2/3 of Americans say, let's allow those who have come here without permission to have some pathway to citizenship. But an equal percentage say, I want this to stop. I want people to come in a legal way, in a correct way. The 3 approaches they've taken have been to more border enforcement, guest worker programs, and amnesties or pathways to citizenship. The studies show that all 3 approaches, which your politicians have told you would reduce illegal immigration, have actually done the opposite. Let's take border enforcement more to the conservative side. We now spend $5 billion a year on this. We've gone from 4,000 Border Patrol agents to more than 20,000. Obama just authorized 1,200 National Guardsmen to go to the border as well. And we spend a lot of money on this. And what's happened is if in 1986, half of the Mexicans who came here went home within 12 months. Now, because it's gotten tougher to get in and the smuggling rates as a result have skyrocketed, fewer than a quarter go home within 12 months. So people come here and they stay. And then they bring up, they figure they're going to stay here for a while, so then they bring up their wives and children also without permission. Well, what about the other side? What about an amnesty or pathway to citizenship? Well, we last did that in 1986. 3 million people who were here without permission were allowed to legalize. But then they brought up their friends and family members without permission. So we went from 3 to 0 to 12 to now 11. So I'm not a math major, but I don't think that worked as intended. What about a guest worker program? Well, the last time we did that on a massive scale, the Bracero program, millions of men came from Mexico to work, but the majority, they were supposed to go home after a certain amount of time. The majority of them did not, and many believe that they formed the foundation of what became a large wave of immigration from Mexico. So, okay, what should the U.S. do then if those three approaches haven't worked? Well, if you spend time on those immigrant routes, 2 to 1, what people will tell you along the rails is that the only way to slow this exodus is at its source, in terms of helping to create more jobs in what are 4 or 5 countries that are sending 80% of the people who are coming here without permission. And they say that the U.S. needs, this is an appropriate place to talk about it, that we need a foreign policy centered around the issue of illegal immigration that tries to take this on. Many of them believe that we've basically ignored Latin America since the era of the Kennedy administration. And they say some elements of that foreign policy that would create jobs would be things like microloans. There's a gentleman, Professor Yunus from Bangladesh, who founded Grameen Bank. And you give small loans to women. I'm sorry to say that the loans largely go to women because the men tend to not pay the money back. They use the loans for other purposes. But you give a $100, $200 loan to a woman in a circle of women, and she uses that to create a little business that creates employment, and then she pays it back. The women pressure each other to pay that money back. 99.9% of the money gets paid back. And that's a successful way to try to create employment. They talk about trade policies geared to reducing illegal immigration. NAFTA did the opposite. You and I subsidize all this corn that's grown in Iowa and Illinois and my home state of Kansas. We subsidize it, and it's highly mechanized. So when NAFTA happened and it threw open the Mexican market to U.S. corn, it flooded in, and all these little, corn farmers who had 5 acres couldn't compete with this stuff from the north. So they went out of business. They went to the cities looking for work, couldn't find it. Labor economists believe that about 1 million corn farmers headed north because of NAFTA. I spent time in a factory in Honduras that made scrubs for the U.S. medical market. But the buyers here found that they could get those scrubs a few cents cheaper from China. And so this factory with hundreds of women was about to shut down. And what these women said was, if you know that Honduras is the number 2 sending country of undocumented immigrants to the U.S., why don't you let in more scrubs from Honduras than other places? Wouldn't this make sense? And they talk about encouraging more democratic governments. I think a lot of folks in this country don't know the sometimes terrible history of the U.S. in Latin America and in Central America in particular. But often we've supported these, in El Salvador, the 13 families that pretty much own most of the country that was supported by the military and in turn supported by us. And what we need are governments that are more willing to redistribute some of that wealth and are willing to take on corruption and are willing to take on, I get in trouble in Catholic churches when I talk about this, but overpopulation. Mexico has promoted family planning, and they've gone from 6 kids per family to 2.5. And it's a lot easier to feed 2.5 kids than 6 kids. Most immigrants I talk to would rather stay at home. And students that come up to me, they're like, wow, not everyone wants to come to the U.S. No, they don't. They want to stay at home with everything that they know and love, their children, their family, their culture, their language. They don't want to come here if they don't have to. And a lot of these women say that it would not take radical changes to keep them in Honduras. It doesn't have to become the U.S. If they could feed their kids, clothe them, send them to school, or even have the hope of doing that, they would never leave, and we wouldn't see these thousands of children risking their lives each year on top of these freight trains trying to come and search for them. Thank you.
We do have time for some questions, so if you raise your hand, we'll get a microphone to you.
Let's get a good discussion going.
Good discussion on immigration. Over here. Kate?
Hi. My name's Kate. I'm a student here at the Clinton School. I would like to know if you think that these immigrants can be classified as economic refugees. If so, if not, what's the distinction? And if so, why don't we frame it that way?
I think many immigrants that I saw are economic refugees. They're coming here because they can't eat. I think that there are obviously many people who come here seeking asylum. We recently saw a woman obtain asylum on domestic violence grounds because her husband was, nearly beating her to death every day. I think she's from Guatemala. And she argued that it would be easy with the internet for him she's a school teacher, to find her. And so she was granted, I think last month, asylum in the United States. So people are granted asylum for all sorts of reasons. People are persecuted against because they're gay, on domestic, there's a whole lot of reasons. And I've written about people trying to obtain asylum claiming that they were ex-gang members, and that if you're deported back to places like El Salvador, if you are a former gang member, that the gang will kill you, the other gang will kill you, the cops will kill you if they just see you with tattoos. They're a little less charitable than they are in this country. And so there are many, many people that come on asylum grounds, but the overwhelming majority are coming on economic grounds. And I think that's why I stress that we have to deal with the economic underpinnings of why so many people are coming.
Hi, my name is Julie. I'm also a Clinton School student. First of all, thank you for coming and sharing this compelling story.
Oh, thank you.
If I'm not mistaken, I believe you said you did the journey twice.
Yes.
And so my question is, how did you find the willpower, determination, and strength to go back and do that a second time after the discomfort and the danger and the risks that you went through?
Well, the first time I was writing this as a newspaper series, and I wanted to expand on it for a book. So the book is about 3 or 4 times longer than the newspaper series. And I thought it was important. I'm not particularly religious, but I saw the reaction to my newspaper series and how moved people were by people who were driven by their faith to give and to behave in the way that so many people did. And so I decided to try to take off those blinders and focus more on that, and go back and spend another 3 months retracing the route and focusing on those people. Because sometimes we do have blinders. Journalists try not to, but we all have our baggage, right? And so that's what I did. The second time, I did want to ride on top of the trains again, because every time I was up there, I saw something that, reality sometimes just blows your mind away. Things happen that you couldn't imagine happening, and if you just sit there long enough, things will happen, and this whole world would unfold on top of these trains. But my husband explained to me that if I thought I was going to ride on the trains again, I didn't have to worry about the gangbangers killing me. He was going to finish me off first. So when I talk to students, I say, someday you will learn what compromise is in a marriage. So that was my compromise. So I went alongside the rails and spent another 3 months. But I just felt that it would allow me to tell the story in a much more deep way. Yeah.
Right here. Bill, okay. Bill, right here.
So are you all of one mind on immigration here in Arkansas? Yes?
Hi, my name is John.
She tries to walk that one out.
I found it interesting that in the beginning of your lecture this evening, you had mentioned that a lot of the people that had come up were single mothers and left their children at home.
Right.
Is there something going on in those countries in terms of the family unit?
Yeah.
And could you comment on that?
You know, I thought that single motherhood kind of originated in the United States, but in places like El Salvador and Nicaragua, this goes back to the 50s, I think, before it was considered a major thing here in the United States. And I was trying to figure out, you know, why are there so many single mothers, and you know, what's wrong with the men, quite frankly. So I would ask a lot of the men, what's wrong with y'all? And you know, a lot of them would say, you know, can you explain to me what's going on? And they would say, you know, you know, she wanted to have a kid because she thought that I would stay with her, but then I got bored and I went and had a kid with her. And they weren't really that good at defending themselves, quite frankly. You know, there's one gentleman in Enrique's neighborhood who's kind of put up on a throne by all the women because he actually stayed with his wife. And I mean, some people believe that there are economic underpinnings to this, that as land was consolidated and there were these huge farms and the men would have to travel from one crop to another, and that they would wander in more ways than one. But that's really kind of the economic underpinnings of this, and that they have to do this to survive, basically, to follow the migrant stream. But I think, you know, there are cultural elements. There's the whole machismo. There's the whole, you know, if I have many children you know, when you're very poor, there's very little to have a lot of kind of self-pride in, and in places like Honduras, the men would say, you know, if I have a lot of children from a lot of women, it proves that I'm virile and I'm, you know, a big guy. And so there are a lot of kind of cultural reasons why this is happening as well. But it's a huge problem. I mean, we all know that if you have two incomes in the U.S. versus one, it's a lot easier to get by.
Is that true? Yeah. One second. We'll get you next.
Hi, my name's Kristen. I'm a student at the law school across the street. Thank you for coming today. You were talking about when you were on the trains, you would get off and you had your debit card and you would go eat dinner and sleep in a hotel. How did it feel to see all of these terribly poor people? And I mean, did you just feel like you wanted to feed these children? Can you speak to that a bit?
This is by far, I mean, I described some of the difficulties of being on this journey, but by far the hardest part was that every day people asked me for money or food, for help in some sort of way. I think reporters who cover wars face similar circumstances. And you know, I'm not the kind of reporter that likes to interview people on the phone. I like to get out there on the front lines and describe something as it's happening, because I think, I mean, they say that immigration is a boring issue and the people who don't want to read about it. To me, this was gripping, but I felt that if I put people on the front lines of what was happening, maybe I could grab them by the throat and take them on a ride and educate them along the way. So I think when you're kind of out there watching things as they're happening, it gives an immediacy and a power to your storytelling that you can't get any other way. But when you're there, you face all these ethical dilemmas. And I had kind of been in the fire on this issue before. There's like several books that have chapters about, you know, does Sonia make the right decisions or not on these ethical dilemmas. I had done a story in the U.S., in L.A., in Long Beach, about the 1 in 5 kids in America who grows up with a parent addicted to drugs or alcohol. And so I'd spent time with a 4-year-old girl, Tamika, and watching her life unfold with a mom who was a heroin addict. And some people felt strongly that I should immediately have called the child welfare authorities rather than watch this girl's neglect play out. So I had really tried to think through before going on this journey, you know, what are all the worst case ethical dilemmas, scenarios in each place, and what would I do? Because what I found was that oftentimes bad things happen very quickly. With the 4-year-old girl, the LA Times photographer was with her, and the boyfriend asked the HIV positive girlfriend, should I brush her teeth with your toothbrush? And he shot the photo and it ran in the LA Times. And I was not present, but I can't tell you how many toothbrushes I received with notes telling me exactly where to place them. So I try to think through, you know, if I'm crossing the river with Enrique, will I save him if I see him floundering, or do I wait until he really looks like he's drowning? I'm a former lifeguard. Would I go without a life jacket? Would I go without a compass? Would I go without a phone? If he's going this way and I know that San Antonio is that way and we got to walk 4 to 5 days in 120-degree heat, do I tell him he's going the wrong way, you know? So I try to think through all those ethical dilemmas and what would I do. For me, the dividing line was, is someone in imminent danger? Because as a journalist, I'm not supposed to change something and then write about it. That's considered unethical, because I'm changing reality and then I'm telling you about it. That's wrong. So if I saw someone who was in imminent danger, and I did several times, I helped them, but then I couldn't write about anything that happened to them after that. So for example, there was a 15-year-old girl, Karen, who had been gang raped along a river in the town of Eastepec, and I had been in that spot the day before she was gang raped there. And she was telling me in her jail cell about these two guys who had gang raped her, and the guys were screaming through the bars at us, when you get deported back to this town in Guatemala, our homies control that town, they're going to finish you off. And I made sure that Karen was not deported to that town which they controlled. I felt she was in imminent danger. But if you were simply miserable, then I watched your misery play out, because that's the way to tell the story in the most powerful way possible. And some people find that, reprehensible, that journalists do that, but you explain to people that you're writing about why you're writing their story and why you're doing that, and often they're quite happy to let you do that, because they too understand that it's important to tell their story and get that message across to an American audience. So Enrique is in Nuevo Laredo for 2 weeks. He's lost his slip of paper with his mom's phone number on it, and he's struggling with a bucket of water and a rag to wash cars to come up with 100 pesos, or about $10 to buy another phone card to call back the one number he remembers in Honduras, get mom's number again, and try to continue on his journey. I'm watching this struggle play out. He's eating once a day. I've got a cell phone in my purse the whole time. I don't offer it to him. It would change the course of that was the central point of his story at that moment. It would change the course of his story. Was he miserable? Yes. Was he in imminent danger? No. So I watched it play out. But that's why we do some of the things we do. It's tough. It's very hard. I couldn't sleep many nights.